The Pacific Northwest does not just hold on to its secrets. It buries them under 1,000 years of moss and the suffocating weight of 1 billion pine needles. In the Olympic National Park, the air has a specific kind of density, a saline thickness that feels less like oxygen and more like a liquid you are forced to inhale. It is a place of primordial silence, where the trees grow so thick they weave into a single impenetrable wall of green wood and shadow. People come here to find themselves, but more often than not, the forest finds them first. It is a cathedral of the ancient world, and like all cathedrals, it demands a sacrifice. On a cold, damp Thursday in early April, the park began to tighten its grip on a young man named Jacob Gray. He was 22 years old, a kid with a restless spirit and a bicycle that he treated like a lifeline. He had set out from Port Townsend, pedaling toward the heart of the mountains with nothing but a trailer full of gear and a mind full of questions we will never hear the answers to. On April 6, 2017, Jacob was seen riding along the Sol Duc Road, a winding ribbon of asphalt that snakes deep into the valley. By the following afternoon, his bicycle was found leaning against a guardrail near the 9-mile marker. It was not crashed. It was not discarded in a panic. It was placed there with a deliberate, haunting precision that suggested he intended to return in 5 minutes. But 5 minutes turned into hours and hours turned into a silence that has never truly been broken. When the rangers first arrived at the scene, they found a tableau that defied the standard logic of a disappearance. Jacob was gone, but his world was laid out on the gravel like a museum exhibit of a life interrupted. His bicycle sat upright. His trailer was still attached. Nearby, searchers found his camping gear, his 4-piece fly rod, and a mountain of clothes. Most unsettling of all were the arrows. They were scattered in a way that felt intentional, pointing toward the rushing white water of the Sol Duc River. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood on the stones, and no footprints leading into the damp earth. It was as if the air had simply opened up and swallowed him whole, leaving his physical possessions behind as an afterthought. The Sol Duc River is a violent glacial artery that pulses with the runoff of the high peaks. In early April, it is a freezing torrent of snowmelt that can sweep a grown man to his death in a matter of seconds. The initial theory was simple and grim. The boy had fallen in. He had slipped on a mossy rock while reaching for water or trying to fish, and the current had claimed him. Divers were called in to probe the dark, swirling eddies of the river. They braved the numbing cold and the treacherous undercurrents, searching every snag and underwater cavern for a body that should have been there. They found nothing. No scrap of fabric, no sneaker, no sign that a human being had ever entered that water. As the days bled into weeks, the search grew in scale but diminished in hope. The Olympic National Park is a vertical labyrinth of cliffs, ravines, and subalpine meadows that can hide a city, let alone a single person. The weather turned sour, as it always does in the Olympics. Sheets of grey rain washed away any scent trails that the search dogs might have followed. The fog rolled in from the coast, thick and white, like a shroud masking the terrain from the eyes of the helicopters. The searchers moved through the brush like ghosts, their boots sinking into the rotting floor of the forest. They were looking for a man, but they were surrounded by an environment that seemed actively hostile to the very concept of being found. While the authorities eventually scaled back their efforts, one man refused to let the forest win. Randy Gray, Jacob's father, became a permanent fixture in the Sol Duc Valley. He was a man driven by a raw primal desperation that only a parent can understand. He didn't have the high-tech gear or the bureaucratic constraints of the Park Service. He had a backpack, a pair of worn boots, and a refusal to accept the silence. He spent months living out of his truck, hiking the ridges and the valleys, screaming his son's name into the wind. He looked in the places the experts said were impossible. He climbed slopes that were nearly vertical and pushed through thickets of devil's club that tore at his skin. He was looking for a needle in a haystack made of emerald and stone. The mystery of Jacob Gray is not just that he disappeared, but where he was eventually found. For over a year, the consensus remained that he had perished in or near the river. It was the only thing that made sense given where his bike had been abandoned. But the wilderness does not care about what makes sense to human beings. In August of 2018, a group of field biologists was working on a remote ridge in the Daniel J. Evans Wilderness. They were nearly 15 miles away from where the bicycle had been found. More importantly, they were at an elevation of over 5,000 feet. In a shallow basin near the summit of a nameless peak, they stumbled upon a scattering of bleached bones and tattered clothing. The recovery team had to be flown in by helicopter. The terrain was so steep and rugged that a ground transport was out of the question. When they analyzed the remains, the truth was more baffling than the disappearance itself. The bones belonged to Jacob Gray. He hadn't drowned in the Sol Duc. He hadn't been swept away by the river. Instead, for reasons that defy any rational explanation, he had left his bike, his food, and his camping gear behind and started walking. He didn't walk along the road. He didn't follow the established trails. He had climbed. He had ascended thousands of vertical feet into some of the most unforgiving terrain on the North American continent, moving toward the high cold peaks where the air is thin and the cover is non-existent. Think about the physical exertion required for such a journey. To move from the river valley to that high ridge, a person would have to navigate through miles of blow-down timber, cross multiple smaller streams, and scramble up rock faces that would challenge a seasoned mountaineer. And Jacob did this without his heavy gear. He did it in early April when the high country is still buried under 10 feet of snow and the temperatures at night drop well below freezing. He was heading into a vertical wasteland of ice and rock with no survival equipment, moving away from the safety of the road and the warmth of his sleeping bag. It was not a hike. It was a terminal trajectory. In these cases, we often hear the term paradoxical undressing. It is a phenomenon where a person suffering from extreme hypothermia begins to feel a false sensation of intense heat. Their brain, misfiring in its final moments, tells them they are burning up, and they begin to strip off their clothes, even as they are freezing to death. But paradoxical undressing usually happens in the final stages of life. It does not explain why a man would leave his bicycle and gear at the bottom of a mountain and climb 4,000 feet toward the sky. It does not explain the intentional placement of the arrows by the river. It suggests a different kind of influence, a cognitive break, or an external pressure that we cannot quantify. There is a recurring theme in the annals of the missing that we call the high-altitude placement. Time and time again, we see individuals disappear at lower elevations, only to have their remains discovered in locations that are physically improbable, if not impossible, for them to have reached on their own. They are found on the tops of ridges, on the ledges of inaccessible cliffs, or in the centers of boulder fields where no footprints led. It is as if they were being drawn toward the heights by a force that overrides the survival instinct. Or perhaps they are being placed there by something that operates outside our understanding of geography and physics. The state of Jacob's remains offered no clues to his cause of death. The elements and the scavengers had done their work. There were no marks of predation on the bones that suggested a cougar or a bear had been the aggressor. There were no broken limbs that would indicate a fall from a height. He was simply there, resting in a place where he never should have been. The investigators closed the case, citing exhaustion and exposure as the likely culprits. But for those who have spent time in the deep woods, the official explanation feels like a thin bandage on a gaping wound. It ignores the fundamental strangeness of the behavior. It ignores the geography of the impossible. When you look at the map of the Sol Duc Valley, the distance between the bike and the ridge is a straight line of jagged peaks and deep canyons. To a bird, it is a few miles. To a man on foot, it is an odyssey of pain and endurance. Why would a 22-year-old in the prime of his life choose that path? If he was suicidal, there were 1,000 easier ways to end it right there at the river. If he was lost, the logic is to follow the water downstream, not to climb into the clouds. There is a coldness in this story that has nothing to do with the Washington weather. It is the coldness of a predatory indifference, the feeling that Jacob was not the master of his own movements in those final hours. We see this pattern in other places, in other parks, under different names. In 2014, a man named Aaron Hedges went missing in the crazy mountains of Montana. He was an experienced hunter, a man who knew the high country like the back of his hand. He disappeared during a trek to a base camp. A year later, his boots were found miles away in the opposite direction of his destination. His backpack was found on a different ridge. Eventually, his remains were discovered on a private ranch, miles from where any logic would place him. Like Jacob, he had shed his gear in a systematic way. Like Jacob, he had moved across terrain that should have been impassable for a man in his condition. The mountains have a way of distorting our perception of reality. There are accounts from survivors of near-miss disappearances who speak of a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. They describe the forest going silent, the birds stopping their songs, and a feeling of being watched by something that does not have eyes. They speak of a sudden disorientation, where the North Star seems to move, and the trail beneath their feet dissolves into nothingness. Some describe a voice, a familiar sound calling them from just over the next ridge, leading them higher and higher into the thin air until they can no longer find their way back. Jacob Gray was a son, a brother, and a friend. He was a human being with a future that was snuffed out in the shadow of Mount Olympus. His father eventually found the closure of a body, but he will never find the closure of a reason. The park remains beautiful and terrifying, its moss growing over the spots where the searchers once stood. The Sol Duc River continues its violent rush toward the sea, carrying the secrets of that April morning in its cold grey depths. We like to think that we are the masters of the wilderness, that our maps and our GPS units have tamed the world. But the map is not the territory. There is a threshold you cross when you step off the pavement and into the ancient growth. It is a boundary between the world of man and the world of something much older. Most people cross it and return without ever realizing how thin the ice really was. But for some, the ice breaks. For some, the forest decides that it is time for a change in the scenery. They become the data points on a map of the unexplained. They become the names we whisper when the campfire burns low and the shadows begin to stretch toward our tents. The case of Jacob Gray echoes the disappearance of Jared Atadero in the mountains of Colorado. A 3-year-old boy who vanished while hiking with a group of adults. He was ahead of the group by only a few yards when he turned a corner and was gone. For years the mountains held him. When his remains were finally found, they were located high up on a cliff face, a place that a 3-year-old could not have climbed in 1,000 years. Like Jacob, his clothing was found in a state that suggested it had been placed, not dropped. Like Jacob, the location of his recovery mocked the efforts of the searchers who had combed the valley floor for weeks. These are not isolated incidents. They are the symptoms of a phenomenon that we are only beginning to categorize. We look for footprints, but we find only silence. We look for motives, but we find only anomalies. The wilderness is not a park. It is not a playground. It is a vast, sentient engine of entropy that does not recognize our laws or our logic. When you go into the woods, you are a guest. And sometimes the host decides that you are never going to leave. As the sun sets over the Olympic Peninsula, the shadows of the trees grow long and thin like fingers reaching out to touch the road. The Sol Duc River moans in its bed of stone, a low guttural sound that vibrates in the marrow of your bones. Somewhere high, on a ridge where the air is too cold for life, the wind whistles through the gaps in the rocks. It sounds like a name. It sounds like a warning. But by the time you hear it, the forest has already decided where you are going to be found. The pattern remains. The mountains remain. And the silence is the only answer we are ever going to get. Good night.